Yep.
Okay.
If I move around, hopefully somebody here is on it in a way that they can tell me I'm in the wrong place, because I don't think I can stand still.
I've got you here, so
Okay. All right. All right. We're good. So we're ready to go.
Yes. The floor is yours.
All right. So our topic is as broad and as deep as we can possibly be. We are going to discuss fundamentals of what it means to live in the adaptive universe. We are all in it. It has rules. We are trapped by its rules. Our behavior, our seeking advantage through technology, organizational change, etc., powers it, creates pressures. We're tempted by the new technologies as if we could escape the basic rules of the adaptive universe. So we're going to talk about its rules and what those mean. And they're shocking, not just different, shocking, because it doesn't remotely work the way we normally think it does. We're trapped in oversimplifications and the pursuit of linear assumptions that don't apply. Now, we've gotten away with that trick quite a bit. And the question is, how do we deal with the complexity of the adaptive universe, its basic rules and characteristics, when the processes of success no longer allow us to make the linear assumptions? So we have 3 stops. We'll do a little prologue before we get into the 3 stops. One, we're going to talk about phenomena. If you have a science, there's a phenomenology. Fancy word. It means there's phenomena, there's patterns, there are empirical results, there are generalizations from those empirical results. Some of those actually have law-like properties in the sense that they spread across different settings. So we have general results, and these are patterns about how adaptive cycles play out. And we'll talk about that and a little bit of the phenomena and illustrate it with high-frequency trading, the rise of high-frequency trading. The second stop is the science. Given we have a set of phenomena and generalizations and empirical laws, where do they come from? What explains them? What are the fundamentals that exist behind the surface observations? And so this is our science base, these fundamentals, and the candidate, and the only candidate of a comprehensive approach to understand this is the theory of graceful extensibility. So we'll talk about some of the basics in the theory of graceful extensibility. The third is, so if you have a good science, right, it helps explain the phenomena that are repeatedly observed across settings. But it has another important property, and that is classically described as helps with prediction. But from the point of view of the relationship of science and engineering, that ability of a good theory and good fundamentals to help you predict is really control of phenomena. The ability to not just understand where phenomena come from, but by understanding the fundamentals, you're able to come back and change, you know, is that phenomena bigger or smaller? If it's an undesirable phenomenon, how do I minimize it, mitigate it, or eliminate it? If it's a desirable one, how do I create it? In other words, that predictive power or control of phenomena is the basis by which science starts to connect to engineering. Now, we'll point out that that's not a one-way flow. A lot of times it's the engineering challenges, difficulties, and surprises which go backwards and stimulate the development of science. Now, so we're going to call that third stop pragmatics. How do the fundamentals, the science basis that comes from understanding where the phenomena arise, what drives them, what are the basic rules of the adaptive universe, that should drive a new pragmatics. And pragmatics should be humble in the sense that all engineering follows a set of steps in order to really make a difference, and to be careful and measured about how we make a difference in the world. We are often losing that humble engineering in the context of hype cycles on new technology. And I've lived through 4, 5, 6 different hype cycles on new technology that don't play out the way the advocates intend or predict. In our case, the pragmatics needs to be humble and we have a good start, but it is very different engineering. It is why I called this resilience engineering 19 years ago in the aftermath of NASA accidents, that we could and should be able to develop this as a way to move forward. And so we'll talk a little bit about where and how we develop those pragmatics. How do I change? Why isn't this changing?
Your right arrow doesn't work.
He probably clicked on the
Yeah, click on your
presentation.
on your presentation itself. Yep.
Oh, okay, there we go. So first off, for those of you who haven't seen the theory or previous papers of this, the key idea is graceful extensibility. It's a positive capability to stretch when surprise occurs, when events in the world drive you near and past the boundaries or the envelope of competence. And any system, any network, we tend to refer to systems as networks, and especially kind of network called a layered network, and in particular that these layered networks are tangled layered networks. They all have boundaries. Surprise happens at the boundaries, and all systems require some positive capability to stretch how they perform when events challenge their boundaries. Graceful extensibility is the opposite of brittleness. Brittleness are systems that quickly degrade, performance collapses when surprise challenges their boundary conditions. And a variety of results, including formal proofs of theorems within a certain limited mathematical domain by John Doyle and colleagues called robust yet fragile, illustrates that graceful extensibility trades off with optimality. There's a trade-off function where pursuit of optimality can, in the absence of the right architecture, end up degrading graceful extensibility. And we've studied and identified this by looking at a variety of kinds of settings where surprise is tangible, from space shuttle mission control to emergency medicine and a variety of others. So with that, we'll come back to this. So let's start with our prologue. The adaptive universe is a biological universe, not physics. It's biology. And the best way to understand this is the two quotes from Lynn Margulis, one of today's leading evolutionary biologists. And the first is, life is a verb. Life is about action. Life is about activity, right? And our systems, if they're going to be resilient, are going to, we have to focus on the verbs, hence the title of the piece that was circulated, Resilience is a Verb. And the second summary line she uses is, life developed by networking, not by combat. And people seem to not understand and be stuck in a 19th century reaction to the biological advances, and not understanding that how networking and how conflict resolution mechanisms arise as goals conflict, as the network grows in complexity and capability. Now, what this means is a couple different things. One, as a biological root, it's exemplified at levels all the way from cells, the healthy heart, right, as a human physiology or the stress response system. The sick heart, that becomes a human physiology technology system. The neurobiology of perception and attention, how the brain works, and we can talk about specific examples from that. We could talk about it from cognitive systems engineering, joint cognitive systems of people and computers, and the different kinds of results we have in that setting. Larger scale approaches to socio-technical systems, organizational development, and social systems, as we'll refer to the work of Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize in 2009. Now, so we have all these different levels to talk about, and that exemplify the basic rules and what happens when you violate those rules, which gives us another point here. The rules of the adaptive universe are control laws, and control laws have a funny quality. You can violate control laws, but you can't avoid the consequences of violating control laws. So the simple example is, nothing is going to stop you from building a high center of gravity car. You want to build a high center of gravity car, you're perfectly capable to build it. But if you try to drive it fast on curvy roads, right, it will tend to flip over some of the time. Now you can come back and say, well, gee, the driver failed or something else failed and focus on a component explanation. But fundamentally, the system is set up in a way that will not perform as intended, right, under the different kinds of environmental constraints. In the biological language, right, that high center of gravity car is not well fit. The simple word FIT, fitness, in this biological root that goes back to the 19th century emergence of evolutionary thinking. The system is not fit relative to the environment it's trying to operate in, the tasks, the activities it's trying to carry out, the goals it's trying to achieve. So, and then notice the first thing on this slide, it doesn't matter what your role or title is, you're not exempt from the rules of the adaptive universe. That's a little bit of a surprise because we got tons of managers and researchers and mathematicians and autonomy creating people who think the rules don't apply to them. They only apply to some other set of people or activity or role, and that those settings can be solved, that they can stand outside the adaptive universe and influence it and change it for some other setting, some other people. But in fact, everyone's in it. No matter what your role or title, we're all in this. Ultimately, the fundamental rule here is viability requires extensibility. In order to be viable in the long run, surprise will happen. You do have boundaries and limits on the competence that's designed into the system, however much that competence appears to be better than in the past on certain criteria. And to be viable when inevitably surprise happens, requires some capability for extensibility, some way to adapt the way you've adapted in the past. All right, stop one, phenomenology. We have been studying adaptation and surprise in risky high performance settings for a long time. Essentially, for myself, since the 3 Mile Island accident, we're now 40 years into doing this. We can say there was a bunch of this even earlier, but certainly in the modern era, the motivation and triggering event of 3 Mile Island nuclear accident has led to a wide range of studies. Today, since the 2004 first resilience engineering meeting, we use the phrase, the difference between work as imagined and work as practiced or done. It captures the ways that people are adapting to make systems work, to work around gaps and complexities. Fundamentally, what we were studying is a subset of adaptive cycles, right? Cases where people searching for advantage on their goals did a variety of things. In doing that, new points of complexity and brittleness arose, and other kinds of people had to adapt to fill the gaps and work around the bottlenecks that appeared. And so I summarize, another way to summarize these studies of adaptive cycles, especially from a cognitive systems, joint cognitive systems point of view, is that stories of change reveal the new forms of congestion, cascade, and conflict that arise when the apparent benefits get hijacked. Notice the kinds of verbs and activities that are going on in a line like this, right? And it starts with change or the projection of potential change, right? There were forms of congestion, conflict, and cascade. Those don't get eliminated because some change or improvement is envisioned or deployed into the world, but rather there are new forms, changes in where and how congestion, cascade, and conflicts arise. And if we want to understand where things are going, we need to understand those emerging effects that go beyond what was projected or envisioned. You can look back at the papers that we wrote. Sydney and I, Decker and I have one from 1999. So the envisioning papers are almost 20 years old. There's also some nice ones with Axel Rossler from University of Washington, who was here studying in those early OOs as well. And then the last activity here is, notice the line, when apparent benefits get hijacked. Whatever those who seeking advantage think will be the benefits, other parties are active seeking their advantage and will take advantage of the other's advantage in their own way and for their own purposes. And that word hijacked is deliberate, to push this as far as we can to understand kind of ways that success will be seized by other roles seeking advantage, and that the big driver of adaptive cycles isn't simply messing up your new design or technology, organizational change, but it's actually the biggest driver is success, that it does do something valuable. All right, so let's quickly remind you, we're going to do 3 things to remind you of the phenomenology. The cartoon is the first one. Right, in 50s, as this cartoon from Jen Sorensen lays out, we thought new technology and automation would lead to more human leisure, more relaxation, higher quality of life. And instead, we've all been surprised with stagnant incomes, round-the-clock productivity. What actually played out was quite different, as we see that the new resources led to a different set of pressures and connections, surprising reverberations of a change in a layered network. And so I call these tangled layered networks, as we'll see in these examples. The second one is this animation series we put together a few years ago, and some of you may have seen in other talks. Right? The standard view is we look at the world through the lens of our plans, automata, right? Organizational design. And when we look at the world through the plan, the world is always in its springtime. The flowers are in bloom, the trees are leafing out, everything looks great because the plan holds all of the things we thought mattered and try to improve relative to past plans or automation or technology. But in fact, what we have is a look outside the boundaries or confidence envelope by that plan or automata, and there's other people taming the dragons of surprise that are threatening to burn down our forest and consume our flowers, etc. Now, the dragons of surprise, as some of you know, preceded Games of Thrones metaphors and things, but this cannot be more appropriate to do this talk with this image today after last night's episode of Game of Thrones, if any of you happen to catch it. It was a little dramatic in terms of dragons, maybe not quite as surprising as it should have been to everyone. So the point of view of those taming the dragons is looking back at the people admiring their great plans and the criteria that are improving for those plans and saying, hey, I need a little help over here. Now, the animation here, I want to remind people, even if you've seen this before, is not simply about 2 people. It's not simply about 2 kinds of roles, all right? It's really about 2 kinds of adaptive capacity. And that the fundamentals, as we develop the theory and move towards the second stop on science, is that there are 2 kinds of adaptive capacity. It is, and those both have to be there, right? We have to have the ability to improve our confidence envelope, to get better with respect to frequently encountered events and variations, right? And at the same time recognize that novelty and surprise will occur. It is inevitable. It will challenge the boundaries of the confidence envelope defined by the changes in our technology plans and organizational designs, and that we have to have that capability to adapt at the boundaries, that graceful extensibility. So there's 2 kinds of basic adaptive capacities. They interact, they're interdependent, right? They're not simply linear and additive. But we need both. And there are simple examples of this, such as neurophysiology, the neurobiology of the brain. It gets better at frequently encountered stimuli, events, and variations for each context that system. It develops a set of high frequency responses relative to these different contexts it exists in. At the same time, the brain is constantly on the lookout for what's unexpected, what doesn't fit, right? The anomalies out there, the unexpected behaviors, the surprises, in order to adapt. And it's not hard to think from a biological perspective that both of these capabilities are needed. Specialization right? You would think of the improving plans and automata as a form of specialization of fitness. I am specializing my response capabilities to be better, to be more fit with respect to what is the high frequency encounters in the world. Right, so what I tend to experience, I get more fit. And this goes all the way back to Darwin and the Galapagos Islands and Darwin's finches. As the generalized finch beak gets specialized for the different food resources on different islands. Now remember, Darwin's finches, not only as they change to exploit resources in their environment, they not only change themselves, one beak becoming long and slender for flowers, another becoming short and strong for exploiting nuts, they change the environment. By adapting to nuts versus flowers, increase the spread of nut producing and flower-based resources for these organisms to exploit. However, as they became more specialized for certain characteristics of the environment, they became more vulnerable to a larger shift in environmental patterns and resource distributions and competition. So becoming more specialized made it more brittle to change relative to a generalized species or organism. Now, let's remind everybody, while we can use complexity in a variety of ways, what we're really doing is talking about the extensive and hidden interdependencies that arise, especially as capabilities increase. The picture on the left is one people have seen for a long time of a spaghetti diagram on the US deployment to Afghanistan. The one on the right is a hand-drawing cartoon of someone in the critical digital services, web engineering and ops world, drawing an illustration of how interdependent their world gets as we have new capabilities operated at new scales, as we're all digitally dependent in whatever activity we do, and as a variety of internet-based, web-based enterprises and activities have gone on. So, third example, the rise of high-frequency trading. So we did the graphic ones already, easy to understand, nice cartoon, nice animation, reminding us of how these things work. Now let's talk about it as detailed data, which means you got a table. Hopefully you can read something on the table. We can send you a not for distribution copy of the table as it's in draft state, and we're still refining it to make sure we have this as well laid out as possible. High frequency, so let's take a few minutes to talk about the rise of high frequency trading because it illustrates some of the fundamentals here. It's a case of fluorescence. People seeking advantage very rapidly were willing to spend tens upon tens of millions of dollars for slivers of speed. And that speed advantage gave them an ability to front run. Front running means they could step ahead of a trade you were proposing, especially large trades, and be able to manipulate the market for slivers of money. But because the market now operates at higher and higher volumes, those slivers of money driven by slivers of speed turned into hundreds of millions of dollars of profit. So they were quite willing to spend tens of millions of dollars to get that. And once they had that advantage, the whole market, the whole financial trading market started to adapt and change. In that process, new kinds of organizations emerged, dark pools. Dark pools aren't a company. They're not simply a new capital letter title within or role within an organization. It's a whole new function that could exist as its own company, exist as parts of other companies, and represented a whole new kind of player, a new kind of predator, actually, as it's described in the market. And what kind of prey in the financial trading could they take advantage of? Now, what's interesting as you look through, the left column is a summary of the rise of high-frequency trading and the emergence of IEX as a neutral or fair stock exchange in response. On the right are how this is an example of what it means to study and lay out adaptive cycles. An ongoing processes of adaptation with unseen and misseen reverberations, partial incomplete models that are fragmented over roles, a very heavy hysteresis on old mental models, that the understanding the changes ongoing the understanding process lags far behind the actual changes. new roles at multiple levels. The network becomes more complicated. Your ability to draw it becomes just like those cartoons we put up a moment ago, a spaghetti diagram, right? So everybody who's trying to draw out for their multi-agent simulation a definite set of nodes and links have already violated the basic rule of the adaptive universe, right? Let me repeat that again, right? If you're drawing something where you can specify all the nodes and links as if they were definitive and fixed, you've already mismodeled a tangled layered network. You have misrepresented in a fundamental way the adaptive universe, right? We see processes of seeking advantage and finding, discovering opportunities and opening up those opportunities. And what happens is scale increases. Finer and multiple time scales, right? Very, very short, and as well as longer ones, more variability, more players, more cross-scale interactions. Complexity penalties increase. What's very interesting in this is how opaqueness becomes both a cost and an advantage, right? So without being able to see what's going on, it's harder to be able to be intelligent about your trading behavior. On the other hand, for the dark pools and others, opaqueness was an advantage to be kept. And to reveal and to make things transparent would have undermined their ability to have advantage and be profitable in the markets. It is a case of fluorescence and how fluorescence creates new kinds of gaps and problems that require adaptation. As anomalies emerged, we had a story of dark pools, a story of high-frequency traders that didn't exist before, but we also have a story of Brad. It's about an individual who was really focused on why these odd behaviors in trading when he was at the Royal Bank of Canada. And he didn't give up on those anomalies, that something about my model of how trading works is off. I've got to figure out why, what's going on. And so the complexity penalties led him to try to understand what was going on and how the value for some comes at cost for others. How forensics was failing. The oversimplification tendencies of attributing anomalies to a single action in a tangled layered network completely misrepresents the forms of mechanism and function that go on in these situations. How important it was to innovate new forms of observability at the same time that, looking up a couple bullet points on the right, the change produced opaqueness, which was an advantage for some. So there's competition over opaqueness and observability. By avoiding shallow explanations, he ended up recruiting an ad hoc set of people trying to figure out what in the world is going on that's new here to build an explanatory account. So it's a hypothesis exploration process, and he begins to then discover new aspects of what's going on and the different ways that advantage, basically a kind of cheating is going on. How they've manipulated the rules, which, by the way, arose from a previous adaptive cycle where there was a failure, which led to new regulatory changes, which led to the fully computerization of trading and the ability to have more and more stock exchanges, more and more trading, more higher trading volumes, all of which were fuel for the fluorescence and adaptive cycle of high-frequency trading and dark pools. So he starts doing his model updating, revision, and reframing, building new explanations. His interventions become key tests for directions in which to reestablish neutral trading. And his team is starting to build a mechanism within their one bank of how to counter or undo the gaming of the high-frequency traders who aren't going to give up without a fight, right? And they want to keep their riskless advantage. He's trying to present the gaming and develops a product to defend traders from the new predator in the market. And initially gets some success, but it stalls. So we see another kind of mini fluorescence relative to the big one, and it stalls out. And eventually the insight is he has to move all the way to a new stock exchange. Doesn't know exactly how this would work as a neutral stock exchange, and they have to move towards becoming a new organization, take high risk. They all are losing money. All of the people who join up to IEX are losing in the short run in order to pursue an uncertain future of what a neutral stock exchange would look like in this new world of what's going on. Even with all of their work to ungame the system to make it neutral, right, which was in many ways successful, they were still surprised when they launched, right, because the predators, the high frequency traders and dark pools invented new ways to take advantage of the new player in the world of a neutral stock exchange. And it looked like the new IEX stock exchange might fail until a major bank made a different decision, which apparently boiled down to two people deciding it was in their advantage in the marketplace to keep a neutral exchange alive, and were running enough trading, they're trading through it to give it enough resources to be a player in the market. The story ends, but it doesn't really end because adaptive cycles, right, continue to change and move forward in a variety of ways. And IEX in itself has changed and had to respond to several new events, regulatory changes, and other things that confronted them with surprises in a variety of ways, right? There's a variety of patterns there about how trying to be more robust also contributed to being more resilient when surprises still occurred. What they could draw on when the dark pools responded in an unexpected way when they launched. And they had to understand and respond quickly. How neighboring units interact in order to align goals and activities so that the new player could be viable. So what does all of this about the phenomena point to us? Systems are messy. And some people in some roles provide essentials for resilient performance. As Asher found this great sign we've used for a number of years now, the system was never broken, it was built this way. That's snafu, situation, normal, all fucked up. That coinage from a World War II grunt soldier, right, is normal. It is the natural state of systems. We, from our distant views, think it is pristine and coherent and well organized and everything should work according to plan. And so deviations and problems where people's ability to adapt and make up for the gaps and limitations and the surprise events that occur regularly hide the difficulties and hide the dilemmas that they have to work on, hide the gaps. And so when they fail to provide that resilient performance, we think of it as people being defective. And if they only would work to rule, work to roll, work to plan, then the system would be great again. And that's a fundamental misunderstanding because, right, finite resources and continuous change is ongoing in the adaptive universe. Pressures, right, to perform better on some criterion are ongoing. They may vary in terms of intensity, but they're ongoing. So snafu becomes normal and the ability to be poised to adapt. So snafu is the natural state, snafu catching is an essential ingredient. That's kind of a euphemism for graceful extensibility. Now, what are we explaining? Out of all the phenomena, we could go on with a variety of rules beyond the fluency law, law of stretch systems, etc. There's a fundamental pattern that all of the work trying to understand complex or adaptive systems in complex worlds is about. And that is under pressure to be more optimal, to be under faster, better, cheaper pressure, new forms of complexity and brittleness emerge. So you end up with this paradoxical result that when events fall within the confidence envelope, the system looks great and is continuously improving. However, sudden large failures occur when events challenge those boundaries, right? So that's a sign of brittleness with insufficient capacity to adapt at the boundaries, right? We don't have enough graceful extensibility. So these are quotes from theorists looking at a variety of kinds of physical and biological systems. Robust perturbations designed to handle yet fragile to unexpected ones and design limits. As connectivity of the network increases, we can get some improvement on average, at the same time, there's an increase in the number of failure extinction events, which have large consequences for the system in question. So that leads us to stop 2. Right? How do adaptive units and tangled layered networks outmaneuver complexity since there's no place to hide? Remember back at the beginning of the prologue, you don't get to step outside the adaptive universe and hide in some other solar system. Sorry, doesn't exist, no place to hide. So we're explaining brittleness, and we're also explaining why these sudden surprising failures don't happen more often. Right? What's new? Graceful extensibility. This idea that viability requires extensibility as a fundamental property of all systems that have to outmaneuver complexity, which is all of us. Right? Net adaptive value, that the 2 elements in that animation are both essential properties for effective systems in complex worlds. And the general parameter of capacity for maneuver, or controlling the risk of saturation. Saturation then being, right, over time, right, as disturbances or variations occur, challenges occur, you're using up your capacity for maneuver in the face of those events. So saturation is a fundamental parameter in control theory. There's textbooks on saturation, but it's used as a correction factor. My math is ideal. Unfortunately, I have to put it into this messy world. And so actuators and sensors have limits. And so we put in correction factors for that. And ultimately, the insight here is no, that's wrong. Saturation is a fundamental property. There's no ideal math and limited physical implementation. We're all in the adaptive universe. That's a fundamental characteristic of all adaptive units at all scales. Whether we're talking about BRAD, whether we're talking about IEX, whether we're talking about dark pools, whether we're talking about high-frequency traders, all of those are adaptive units. And the issue is, right, they have limits, they have a confidence envelope with limits and boundaries. They don't know where those boundaries really exist. They're overconfident they know where they are. They also are pretty sure that they're bigger than they really are and more complete than they really are. Surprise occurs more often than they expect and in patterns that they aren't really prepared to deal with or overconfident that their base capacity is able to handle. So what are we predicting? We're predicting how unintended consequences emerge from units that are in a network locally adapting. And what emerges from those network of local adaptations allows us to see the general emergent properties and behaviors and consequences of these tangled layered networks. What do we need? We need architectural principles for how do you set this up, learning from the biological, cognitive system and social system success stories that are out there. So we can generalize some ways to set these systems up to have the right balance and not trade off the search for optimality with graceful extensibility, but rather have those two work together to create a better net adaptive value. Adaptive value, a lot of the terms I use are deliberately taken from a history of success stories and comments in biology. Adaptive landscapes go to the 1920s. Adaptive value goes back to the 19th century. Net adaptive value is just a slight variation on that. Saturation goes back to fundamentals and control engineering. So even though the theory takes on a variety of novel implications and directions, it's trying to draw as much as possible from a variety of threads of long-standing commentary. So the theory of graceful extensibility is integrating results from, as I just laid out, a wide variety of areas, right? And it really is laying out another characteristic of the biological root, which is the search for fitness is ongoing. It goes back to Huxley in the 1860s and 70s. In other words, the question of what is fitness is always a question. It's always a question being re-answered in each moment for each time scale. Fitness isn't a solution. Fitness is a question. What is the best way and response capabilities to build up given the potential for surprise and variation in a changing world? So we can run through a little bit of the theory of graceful extensibility, and I'm not going to do a lot of that. We don't really have time today. The paper is out 2018. If you go to ResearchGate, you can get it and dig through it. It will challenge you. It will make your mind hurt. It's deliberately written out in as a quasi set of theorems, provable pieces, in a sense, trying to lay it out in terms of a set of 10 minimal logical steps. And the thrust of this is not simply in each step, one by one. That would be a linear assumption about it, which is a temptation as we start to understand it, but rather how these different individual logical steps add up, reinforce each other, combine to produce some important emergent findings about behavior and basic rules of the adaptive universe. A couple things as you dig into it to remember is adaptive capacity, being poised to adapt, is about the future. It's always about the potential to modify plans to better fit the situations actually encountered. Again, this goes back in biology and evolution, but as a potential, it has to exist before changes and disruptions call upon those capacities. And we have more and more examples from biology of architectures that facilitate future adaptability. Facilitate adaptability in the future, despite the fact I have an incomplete understanding of what that future is going to look like. And biology continues to select for that future adaptive capacity. It's really quite remarkable. There is what's an adaptive unit or a unit of adaptive behavior that exists at nested scales, and that's illustrated by the high frequency trading example. So when you dig into that, you can see how these units are active, seeking to improve how they fit their environment and given the activities of other interdependent nearby units in the network. So we're looking at adaptive units in the network, and we'll talk about the constraints on this. The main constraint to understand is, and then I'll skip through the theory, is to be an adaptive unit in the universe, you must have non-zero graceful extensibility. If you don't have some graceful extensibility when challenged at the boundaries, you're brittle and you will collapse. And that threatens your viability in the long run. So biology does not allow adaptive units with zero graceful extensibility. We, as engineers, love to design systems and claim, because we think the confidence envelope is bigger, that we don't need graceful extensibility. Hence, discovering it is novel. Because we keep trying to say we don't have to have it. This generation of new technology is better than the last, so I don't have to build in any graceful extensibility. Now, the second thing is the fundamentals start with only two assumptions. One is finite resources and the change never stops. If we're given finite resources and change never stops, the graceful extensibility of any single unit is limited. So you have to have some and you can't have enough. That's fundamental constraints on any adaptive unit, which means neighbors have to help. So the key thing in a network architecture is how do you set it up so the neighbors will help? And a variety of standard things that are done do the opposite. They constrict the graceful extensibility of a unit because of the way pressures are distributed. Very noticeably, and you can look at Sydney's latest book, the pressure for compliance to rules and roles undermines graceful extensibility, undermines the expression of initiative, which reduces or zeroes out graceful extensibility and makes systems too brittle. So we have to have ways where neighbors know when to act to support another unit that's getting into trouble. In other words, it's getting harder and harder for it to stay in control for its scope of responsibility. In other words, its risk of saturation is increasing. It's running out of capacity for maneuver. And so another unit has to engage in order to extend that capacity as the situation deteriorates or grows in difficulty and disturbances cascade. Now, we can go back to the phenomenology and give you a whole bunch of examples of this, going all the way back to cases I was doing back in the early 80s in nuclear power, all the way up to computer-supported cooperative work, and moving forward into other kinds of settings at multiple levels where this stuff plays out. So there's lots of empirical basis for where this stuff comes from, but
David?
that's not the point. Yeah.
David, now we are having like 15 minutes until the end of the
Give me
webinar.
5 more minutes. Yeah, give me 5 more minutes.
Okay.
All right. So we're going to skip through this, and people can go and look at the theory and how a variety of lines come together to make the theory work and generate it. Again, the key idea is that it's not simply an empirical generalization, but these are fundamental principles about the way the adaptive universe works. Quickly, a couple things before I summarize with some of the pragmatic implications. Organizations want to rationalize the need for graceful extensibility on 3 grounds: rarity, prevention, and compliance. All of these are technically and empirically and theoretically wrong. And so we'll see these over and over again from a variety of organizations. And we can talk about these more, or you can see this in some of the recent papers. There's a variety of fundamental implications of this. The network indeterminacy principle, it reframes what it means to be pursuing optimality. These are pretty shocking things for a variety of disciplines and engineering and management approaches out there. But I wanna talk for 5 more minutes on pragmatics. It's not enough to have explanation. Social scientists claim to explain some of these things, from Eleanor Ostrom's work to high reliability organizations. What's the problem? They've got no pragmatics. Surveys, culture change, they've got no pragmatics. Did I say that? No pragmatics. There is no model of pragmatics and how this can translate into ways to outmaneuver the complexity, build and sustain graceful extensibility. Joint cognitive systems engineering. We have pragmatics. The problem is our pragmatics doesn't scale. We can do it, and there's a full employment trying to deal with the gap between work as imagined and work as practiced. There's plenty of jobs for cognitive systems engineers. We just don't scale. And throwing lots and lots of people at those problems in lots and lots of settings isn't a very effective way to deal with the changes going on. So what I want to come back and simply summarize for us is that we're actually making a lot of progress on the pragmatics. If you step back and say, right, let's put it this way. Think about the use of the word resilience. It's extremely noisy. It's used for everything, in every way, now that it's become a hyper popular word. So we got this huge noisy background. Within that, we have people doing something that has some empirical or technical basis around different versions of how they interpret the word resilience. But these are going every which way. They are not pulling together, reinforcing, building, and moving us forward fast enough or effectively enough to support the needs in different kinds of industry sectors and settings. So what we need to do is understand how the science defines certain pragmatic pathways, certain ways to build a pragmatics, to build a humble but different set of engineering capabilities. And that we're making progress in this, and I'm hoping that we will see much more and be able to talk about how to pull these threads together and make them mutually reinforcing in the context of our next REA meeting in Kalmar, Sweden. Fundamentally, the architecture needs to be, how do we set up systems around guiding adaptability, having continuous adaptive capacities, and guiding that adaptive capacity as understanding how things change. And we can see that in a variety of concepts that are emerging with their empirical base and a variety of ways to take that and put it into action. We're doing this mostly in the context of web engineering and operations, as you could really do this They are adopting resilience engineering as a fundamental aspect of how they move forward. We just finished in 2 workshops in California, working heavily with people in this area, as well as some other areas, about how we can define a pragmatic way forward and with very tangible, specific steps. Second area is autonomous machine capabilities. They are, right, our autonomous systems have zero graceful extensibility. They're fundamentally brittle. No wonder people end up having to be essential aspects to add resilience, despite our criticism of people. And we have new capabilities at a mathematical level. We've done a new model of shared control by using the key concepts from the theory. We've done this with Asher with partial autonomy in drones and how you regulate autonomy relative to real-time information, and a new architecture for doing that. Resiliency trade space study, Asher and I again did that for NASA on some new autonomous capabilities on drones for self-separation and controlled airspace. I mentioned the architectures in web engineering and ops are using the risk of saturation and controlling capacity for maneuver, and how that works as a new thread and direction. We're doing it with distributed anomaly response and critical digital services. Laura McGuire's leading work, and we'll have some nice reports and results coming out this summer on how that works. You can talk to her at REA about some of the directions, and she'll be talking on Wednesday afternoon in our critical digital services IT session. And John Alspaw and Richard Cook are leading a variety of activities, again, centered in web engineering on proactive learning mechanisms, and how Mike Rayo is working on the key things of the sacrifice decision under production pressure using the NASA near miss example and doing workshops with that. We've been working with people at DFS at putting this into action as a proactive safety management. So we do have successes in building the pragmatics. And it's not that these are the only ones, and that many of the people listening and people who will be at the next set of meetings have other kinds of forward steps, but rather putting this in this context of what's the phenomenology and generalizations, what's the new science base that's building up, how does that science base give us a bigger view so that we can start to build our pragmatics in a way that they're mutually reinforcing, that we can make more progress, that we can demonstrate that progress. In the end, it's not that the criticism that we don't have a practical applications is incorrect. We have plenty of ways to do practical stuff, right? Yes, they should be more definitive. Yes, we should have some better assessments. Yes, all of that could get better. The problem isn't that we don't have a pragmatics. The problem is it's different. It's not based on linear assumptions, right? So what people keep asking when they say they want more pragmatics is they're saying, no, can you give me something pragmatic that still fits with our linear fundamental organization of how we approach the world? And the answer is no, because the world isn't linear. Go back to the beginning, right? Life is a verb, and life advances through networking, right? Resilience is a verb. Resilience can only be built and sustained by the right kind of networking in the organization that starts with abandoning the linear simplifications, recognizing you can't hide from the complexity of the world. Your successes drive it. They've wiped out all the places to pretend you can hide out. The dragons of surprise are out there. They're going to burn down Westeros, right? You have to outmaneuver complexity. Don't act like Jon Snow, right? You can do better. We are doing better. And I'll see you in Kalmar.
Yes. Okay, David. But we have time for a question. This is a fantastic way to finish that viabilities through networking, and it's quite what we have reflect here. So we still have time for a question. Is there any brave person that would like to ask a question around the world? I see people from Brazil, from Sweden. Yes, please.
I don't know if anybody's trying to talk because I can't hear anything. If anybody wanted to unmute or forgot to unmute.
Matthew is sending
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, so you talked about getting out of the linear model. Have you had success finding ways to convince at organizational scale people to start breaking out of that? Because that seems to be the hard part, at least for my work.
We got asked this last week in California, the same question. Our answer was not very satisfying, I think, in the sense that there's an easy way to deal with this. And it is ultimately the first step. If we're going to make progress with organizations, organizational leadership, it is absolutely fundamental that they start to understand that the simplification strategies don't work in the face of complexity at this scale. Now, we have plenty of ammunition to push that forward with organizations, and organizations have plenty of experience with complexity failures and the surprise of a near collapse or a collapse in their services and the economic consequences. But it's difficult. One of our problems is when we have gotten to the leadership of organizations, the turnover. The turnover of leadership has been rapid in every organization we've worked with at the top. So for example, the CTO level and director level. And it's become a fundamental rule that we have to have a mechanism of working with the company on the assumption that in 6 months, our key advocates and partners will be in a new job or a new organization. The Learning Lab at Lund reminds everyone that before they finish their degree, they will have changed jobs. The odds are pretty high that they will have changed jobs. So it's another form of the kind of change that's going on and how you adapt to this. The second thing is we use the phenomena base by articulating that as a set of general things. And then the third thing is back to the pragmatics. We have to come back and say they're not very interested in the theory if it can't show them the pragmatics. And that's why the emphasis when I talk in Kalmar is going to be that we do have a general approach to pragmatics. The problem isn't that we don't have steps, it's they're different. And the biological examples all have a cost function, a resource investment requirement. And Richard Cook has a great example of this from the physiology of bone remodeling and how that's a continuous energetic process that is resilience in action in a physiological sense. And it illustrates some of the high-level principles and the costs in building that adaptive value. Ultimately, it's about net adaptive value and that's measurable. The problem is it takes two numbers. And so that's the other pitch to management is you're operating on one number, you're confounding a bunch of trade-offs. You have to have two numbers. And you have to see how you're satisfying those two numbers in ways that aren't mutually destructive, if you go back to that animation. We can get them to understand, we can get them to be willing to discuss and move forward. The issue is it's very hard for them to pull the trigger because it's different. It's different engineering. But right now, I find that I think Boeing's example is one that humble traditional engineering is in retreat. And I'm in shock at the engineering failure at Boeing because it's not about exotic or new things. It's about fundamentals that I learned at the foot of great engineers 40 years ago. And it's very shocking to me that those fundamental humble engineering steps were overrun by production and marketing pressure.
I think the other side of this is it goes back to this idea of tangible experience with surprise. In the areas where we have had most success and most sustained success with this, there are organizations that finally realize that they've gone as far down one road as they can, and they're just banging their heads against the wall. And you could make the argument that that's what's happening to Boeing right now. Now they have a tangible experience with surprise. I'm doing some work with a company that does pretty dangerous work, and they decided to do something different when they started killing people, right? So when they have these tangible experiences with surprise is when they decide that a new architecture is needed.
So anyway, other people, anybody else?
Yeah, I want to touch on something you said when you're answering Amy's question. You said that it's not that we don't have steps in these pragmatics, it's just that they're different. Can you maybe expound on that a little bit?
Okay, so I think we can take the autonomy one as a good one. Getting people to think about new shared control directions has proven difficult, despite we have a tremendous amount of data about how to do human autonomy, and that simply automating more and more, or deploying increasing autonomous capabilities and delegating more authority still has surprises at the boundaries, still has boundaries. Surprise still shows up, new kinds of surprises show up. So the Boeing example, remember Boeing, there's the fourth and fifth accidents, not the first and second, the fourth and fifth accidents at least, by my count, where a sensor failure propagates through the automation suite in ways that leads automated subsystems to work at cross purposes with the misbehaving automated subsystem that's getting bad inputs. And then people struggle with between 3 seconds and 3 minutes, 3 or 4 minutes in these 5 crashes to figure out what's going on and intervene effectively or sustain the interventions effectively. So we have a fundamental problem that's going on right now with autonomy. And the scariness, the Boeing case is not simply about Boeing, and not simply about the misengineering that went on in this case. It reflects a general vulnerability. It applies to self-driving cars. We can talk about it with the Tesla accident and the Uber accident and some of their other misadventures. We can talk about it in all software-dependent systems, and guess what? Everybody's a software-dependent system anymore. A distributed software microservices architecture is touching on virtually every sector. Ultimately, the oversimplification tendencies are powerful, and they're attractive, and so they become a key thing. In the end, that's why the middle stuff matters. In the end, this is a science base, and in some sense, our appeal is sort of at odds with the era of a reality science-based approach that says this is the way the world works. If you violate these rules, the things you want to have happen won't happen, and things you really don't want to have happen will happen. And they are not a result of people erring or people being erratic or people not working to rule and roll. They are things you have designed into the system. The system as designed, right, is not doing what the designers intended, but it's doing what it was designed to do. And we have to fundamentally go back to that science base in this. So that's my ultimate response to the maybe a little out of sync with the times, but that the science base, even though management isn't very interested in it and very patient with it, ultimately that's the bedrock that has to be there, not just the phenomena, the generalizations on empirical phenomena, not just the pragmatic methodologies. And in the end, that's the pitch going forward, which is it is pragmatic, it's different. Are you willing to step up? You can't build up this resilience at the boundaries unless you're willing to invest some energy. We can assess net adaptive value. We can make this work, but we got to have half a chance.
So Dave, we were supposed to finish at this time, but if you are happy to leave more questions, we can continue as you wish.
If there's another question or two, happy to chat about it.
Okay.
Yes, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, my name is Samsu Arifin. I'm from health and safety professional from Indonesia. I'm new in this concept about the complexity, resilience, and uncertainty. So my learning on this is watching this webinar is thank you, Dave, for your presentation. Related to the pragmatic is related to the this resilient concept. Is it more like an observational science or something like that? So as practitioner, how we can use this to increase the capacity of the performance of the people and the system that we have. So, can we do that? And can you give me more explanation on that?
So that's a big ticket you want to refer to. The big thing here is to understand that it's not simply improving human performance right now. It's about how the network interactions play out. And so what we talk about as the immediate pragmatic advice are two things: initiative and reciprocity. And you have to look at your architecture for the network and say, where and how are you guiding the expression of initiative? And so we're worried about compliance cultures that undermine that. You can have too much in local initiative, because now you'll get a fragmented, uncoordinated response. But a lot of the organizations today are undermining graceful extensibility because of the compliance pressures that are out there. The second one is reciprocity, and that's probably where you would most likely need to look. Reciprocity is the key thing, comes from Elinor Ostrom, a sociologist who got the Nobel Prize in 2009. And it turns out from a variety of directions, empirically, it's a critical property. It emerges from the theoretical foundations, it's a critical property. And so how do you build reciprocity across units in the network? So when you start thinking of your system as a network with these different adaptive units at different levels, they're messy, and it's not a hierarchy, it's not crisp, messy set of roles and relationships. How do you build and sustain reciprocity? And that's necessary to align performance, align behavior relative to goals and goal conflicts. So a lot of the details we would get in answer to your question is about what system, what's the form of reciprocities that play out, what threatens and undermines reciprocity. In emergency medicine, there's a variety of factors that come into play. And we have a couple papers on this in response to mass casualty events in the Pacific theater. So in Taiwan, there was a 500-person burn event. And so we've been looking, helping out our Taiwanese compatriots in looking at the adaptive response of the emergency medical system and what it draws on as capabilities. Interestingly, it's mostly ad hoc. It's based on initiative, and it's based on reciprocity, but not in any organized or formal way for the healthcare system. And so we're hoping to work some more this summer on laying out new directions for emergency medicine and disaster preparedness. Many of the procedures and practice and scenarios that they set up in order for disaster preparation, I guess we would call them fictional. They're very, very oversimplified, very limited. They don't address the real complexities and difficulties in adapting effectively to an emergency casualty event, especially a mass casualty event, as is starting to happen more regularly in some of the events around the world. So we can refer you to the emergency medicine papers as a start on this, and I'll refer you to a piece that gives a quick overview of reciprocity. Just email me, woods.2@osu.edu, and I'll send you that stuff, okay?
Okay, Pak. Thanks.
All right, thanks everybody for listening in. Sorry I get out of sync with my 3 stops, and by the time I do my high frequency trading example, which is a delicious one because of the way it tries to, and grounding one because of the way it tries to highlight that the standard way we think about units and links in a network is inadequate to the real complexity in the biological adaptive universe. So thanks everybody. It's always more fun to do this all live than through media. So I appreciate you putting up with me.
Yeah,
so
thank you
maybe
very
you'll see
much.
Kalmar or
Yes.
whatever follows Kalmar in 2 years. So sign up for that, or the
Thank
next
you.
time we do a workshop somewhere.
Yeah, we will learn from this experience, and we will put the recording in the website and send the email, so it's available for everyone or your colleagues that could not attend. And we think the next webinar will be towards the end of September, where we will be talking about using innovation games to enhance resilience. So our colleagues from different countries are using games, gamification, so maybe we can learn from that. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Dave. Appreciate it that you share all the work that your group is doing. See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. How do I turn this?